Krishana Logan. Police responded to a suspicious complaint on April 15, 2000, and raced to Robbinswood Avenue in Toledo, Ohio. They discovered Krishana Logan, then 19 years old, dead and abandoned. She had obviously been suffocated and beaten. At first, it looked like the police had a good lead and the inquiry would be finished quickly. However, as fate would have it, there would be no closure to the case for a very long time. There was finally a breakthrough after over 20 years of unanswered questions and unsolved anguish, but it came in a way that surprised everyone. Who then committed this horrific act, and what turn of events brought them to face justice in the end? Krishana Logan, then 19 years old, was employed as an exotic dancer at Platinum Showgirls, a club in Toledo, Ohio, where she went by the stage name Vegas. Krishana was really excited about moving to Texas to further her schooling. Sadly, though, her dreams would never come true. Most nights, Krishana worked at the club, but on April 14, 2000, she took the night off and did not report to work. On April 15th, just before daybreak, her body was discovered in her flat. Theodora Wilson, Krishana's landlord and next-door neighbor, found her body. Theodora went to check up on Krishana because she had heard some noises coming from her flat throughout the night. She was shocked to discover Krishana in the living room, strangled and battered. Michael Mugler, a police officer from Toledo, and his partner were sent to the Robbinswood address to help the fire department with their response. Their main responsibility was to keep the area secure while keeping track of everyone who entered, left, and why. The car belonging to Krishana was towed as proof. Before we continue, we want to remind you that only a small percentage of people who watch our videos are actually subscribed. So if you enjoy our content, consider subscribing. It's free. Now, let's move on with the video. While doing so, Mugler came across a man who introduced himself as Ezel Brown, also known as Zeke, the boyfriend of Krishana Logan, who was strolling down the driveway. He said he wanted to know what was going on. The on-call Toledo police investigator, Detective Terry Cusino, was in charge of taking pictures and recording footage of the crime scene. Even after a careful inspection, no fingerprints that could be used were found. But tangible proof was gathered in the form of several items, such as Krishana's knickers around her right ankle, a black bra around her body, and a flowery dress covering her head. Krishana's autopsy was performed by Deputy Coroner Cynthia Bessier of Lucas County. She provided testimony regarding the interior and exterior injuries to Krishana's neck. Bessier said that Krishana had little alcohol and no illegal substances in her blood, and she took samples from several parts of her body for DNA testing, all of which were corroborated by photos showing the bruises. Bessier declared Krishana's death to be a homicide after determining that she had been strangled. The autopsy report was included in the evidence package. Because there was no evidence of forced entry at the crime site, authorities initially thought she had been slain by a familiar person. As the investigation went on, one of Krishana's high school friends, whose identity remained undisclosed, spoke about her poisonous relationship with her ex-boyfriend, Brown, which was characterized by disputes and fighting, and that Krishana had been trying to stop. Brown stalked Krishana even after she temporarily moved out. She disclosed that Krishana occasionally received presents and cash from Brown, frequently in exchange for personal services. Furthermore, Krishana would sometimes have intimate connections with the people she worked with at the club. However, Krishana always made sure her companion was aware of her whereabouts when she did this. The acquaintance revealed information about what happened the night before the murder. She and Krishana had met at Krishana's flat on Robbinswood Avenue in central Toledo on August 14, 2000, at about 12 o'clock in the evening. To show off Krishana's new Jeep, they drove off. They later made a visit at Krishana's mother's house and said hello to a neighbor. Around 7 o'clock at night, they departed to make preparations for the evening at Krishana's flat and stopped at a few hangouts. Afterwards, they went to a party at the home of Krishana's male neighbor. When it was observed that the two were kissing, they then went to 3 clubs after hours before going back to Krishana's flat at 4 in the morning. The neighbor said that early on April 15, 2000, he had been having sexual relations with Krishana Logan in his room. Despite their past personal relationship, it was strictly platonic and lacked any romantic overtones. He claimed he couldn't remember Christiana's previous relationships, but she was seeing a man from Detroit. Christiana's landlord, Theodora Wilson, gave testimony that matched the details given by her neighbor and friend on the day of the murder. Wilson also remembered seeing a big black man early on April 15, 2000, outside Christiana's flat who looked like Brown. Later, she heard loud music coming from a neighboring automobile, and she saw Christiana and the man walking into her flat. Wilson reported the disturbance to 911, attributing it to Christiana's apartment's furniture being relocated. Since Brown, Christiana's ex-boyfriend, was the only person who could have been connected, Brown was detained as the main suspect in the case. He continued to insist on his innocence, though, and 7 months later DNA evidence proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that he had nothing to do with Christiana's murder. However, the larger pattern that was developing went unnoticed by the investigators at the same time. With Christiana's case, 3 victims in a row were brought under the attention of a persistent criminal. A late teenage girl, whose name has been withheld to preserve her privacy, was walking home in South Toledo at 5:30 p.m. in late August of 2000. She had no idea that her stroll in the evening would become a nightmare. Abruptly, she was taken off the street and taken to a remote location by an unidentified attacker. She was beaten, and it was a terrifying experience. Not too many weeks later, in early October, a little girl, whose name was also kept secret, met a similar end while traveling to school. Similar to the previous victim, she was brutally attacked physically after being forcibly taken by the offender. Residents of the town were terrified as a result of these episodes, and law enforcement officials were left searching for explanations. The incident's evident similarities led investigators to delve more into the relationships between them. They uncovered an important finding while doing their inquiry. The DNA found in the bodies of Christiana and the 2 victims belonged to the same person. But at the time, there were no known culprits in the database that the DNA profile matched. Authorities continued to pursue the offender with greater vigor. Using the recently discovered DNA evidence, they went over the victims' testimonies again in an attempt to extract any further information that would help identify the culprit. A thorough sketch was created as a result of these interviews. The suspect was characterized as a man African with light to medium skin tone who was possibly in his early 40s at the time of the incidents, based on the victims' accounts. He was about 5'7" in height, with a unique mustache and possibly a shaved or bald head. The attacker's huge, bulging stomach was one noticeable trait that both victims noticed. The individual also gave out a distinct beer and cigarette smell, which could indicate certain lifestyle choices. His overall disheveled appearance, along with any scars or blotchy coloring on his face, added to his description. Even while the specifics were still unknown, one victim even mentioned that he might have had a tattoo on his upper left arm. Significantly, both girls attested that the offender was not circumcised, offering a distinct identity that would facilitate his capture. Evelyn Logan, Christiana's mother, made an impassioned plea to anyone who could assist in solving these 3 heinous crimes as soon as these links were made public. However, the identity of the criminal remained elusive and the case stayed cold for years, despite the cooperative efforts of law enforcement authorities and the community's vigilance. The investigation was not given fresh life until 2013 when there was a renewed effort to solve the unsolved case. Thanks to developments in forensic technology and an unwavering dedication to justice, authorities kept looking for leads and looking into ways to bring the case to a close. And at last, a breakthrough happened in 2021, nearly 2 decades later. The culprit's DNA profile yielded a hit in the Combined DNA Index System, or CODIS, despite never matching any criminal database. The identification of Kenneth Marshall, 54, a resident of Hammond, Indiana, was made possible by the much-anticipated breakthrough. Following the link, Marshall was charged with abusing his girlfriend in Lake County, Indiana, but the arrest was unrelated. Following his arrest on November 18, 2021, for this assault, Marshall's DNA was gathered and uploaded to CODIS. From there, It was found to match 3 unsolved crimes from 2000, including Krishana's murder. With assistance from the U.S. Marshals Great Lakes Task Force, Marshall was taken into custody by Hammond police on January 15, 2021, outside his residence on the 900 block of State Street in Hammond, Indiana. With Kenneth Marshall's conviction, a 2-decade horror and violence saga that plagued the lives of many victims came to a conclusion. A jury found Marshall guilty on August 16, 2022, of 5 charges of assault, felonious assault, murder, and aggravated murder. Lucas County Common Pleas Judge Stacy Cook harshly criticized Marshall's actions during his sentence hearing. She underlined how predatory Marshall's crimes were, pointing out that he preyed on weak people in order to satisfy his own desires. Judge Cook made sure that Marshall would be held accountable for his horrible deeds, even in the face of his defense, who claimed that the statute of limitations had run out on some accusations. Marshall's punishment was harsh in proportion to the seriousness of his crimes. Judge Cook sentenced him to consecutive terms for the assault offenses, as well as a life sentence in prison with the possibility of parole. Marshall would therefore only be qualified for parole following his 130-year prison sentence. Marshall's crime had an effect outside of the courtroom as well. The adult survivors testified against him with courage, sharing the anguish they had experienced. The testimony of these individuals was essential in obtaining Marshall's guilt and punishment. Krishana's family have suffered the anguish of living without closure for more than 5 years. They had been burdened by the unsolved questions surrounding her murder. We hope the quest of truth and the knowledge that Marshall will spend the rest of his life behind bars brings some comfort to Christiana's family as the wheels of justice turn and he faces the consequences of his crimes. Moving on to the next case. Marceline Eliza. Marceline Eliza was sent to a hospital in Pensacola, Florida, without any prior information about her condition. Sadly, it was too late since on December 31st, the next day, she passed away. An autopsy revealed that the little child had suffered a brain injury. But what had really happened that awful night? And why did poor Marcelino have to go through such a tragedy? Niceville, Florida is well known for its welcoming small-town vibe. There, locals can enjoy a usually calm environment while exploring a range of recreational and historic monuments. Imagine visiting a historically protected place or going for a stroll around a park. The town's reputation for being nice, not just in name, but in spirit, is often enhanced by the warm and welcoming nature of its residents. But the crime rate, which is prevalent but not particularly high, slightly offsets the city's assets. This seemingly peaceful environment was the scene of Marcelino Liza's terrible case. Marcelina Lisa entered the world on December 15, 2000. She brought happiness into Mary Jane Lisa's life when she entered. Marcelina was a vibrant little girl during her brief life. Her broad, curious eyes were framed by her black hair and plump cheeks. She was residing with her mother, Mary Jean Lee's Tundra Care, in Niceville, Florida as of 2002. The identity of her father is still a mystery. Marcelino was a happy toddler who lived with her mother in a close-knit community. Unbeknownst to everyone, young Marcelina will regrettably experience difficult times shortly. On the morning of December 30th, 2002, Marcelina Lisa and her mother Mary Jean appear to be going about their daily lives in their Niceville, Florida home. A 2-year-old's routine usually centers on enjoying the small things in life, such as breakfast and playing with a favorite toy. Marcelina's day would have begun as any other, with her mother Mary caring for her as she did from the day of her birth. But December 30th, 2002 was a terribly unusual day. Marcelina's mother Mary noticed a sudden and disconcerting change when her daughter went into a seizure and lost consciousness. Marcelino was taken to a hospital in Pensacola, Florida, during a panic attack. Marcelino's condition was serious at this point, and there was little hope even with the best efforts of the medical team. The following day, on December 31st, 2002, Marcelino unfortunately died away at the early age of 2. Her mother immediately felt the terrible weight of this loss. She was truly and deeply saddened. Mary's family members reported the incident to the police right away, as it seemed like Marcelino's death was a homicide. Following Marcelino's untimely demise, detectives descended onto the scene. They began by questioning Marcelino's mother, Mary, and the medical personnel who had attended to the small youngster. Pretty soon, a frightening image emerged. Marcelino was covered with multiple wounds, including 18 bruises on her thin body. The medical examiner concluded, following an examination, that the cause of death was blunt force head trauma, which was consistent with homicide. At the time, the police had no new suspects or leads. In an attempt to find out exactly what had occurred to Marcelino, they put Mary under intense questioning. But Mary was certain that she could not remember any specifics of the event and that she had no idea how her child had passed away. On November 6, 2003, during a second round of interrogation, Mary's account was altered. She told the cops she might have accidentally injured her child when she lost consciousness in a fit of wrath. Mary was now the primary suspect in Marcelino's death as a result of her statement. But proving her guilt was a difficult process. The evidence at hand did not provide a clear connection between her and the crime. A comprehensive investigation was carried out, and several witnesses were questioned by the investigators. They learned that Mary was known for having a very bad temper. However, there had been no prior mention of her experiencing blackouts. Although this new evidence was useful, it was still not enough to conclusively identify Mary as the murderer. Tragically, Marcelino's case began to stagnate as the leads became stale and the evidence was still circumstantial, eventually turning into a cold case, leaving the community in quest of closure and justice for a young life stolen far too soon. Almost 2 decades had passed since Marceline Eliza's terrible death, but Captain David Allen of the Okaloosa County Sheriff's Office and his dedicated team of detectives were not going to let this cold case go unanswered. After almost 19 years, they decided it was time to review all of the information pertaining to Marcelino's death. The group proceeded methodically. They wanted to examine the facts with a new perspective, questioning all of their assumptions and raising doubts about others. They got in touch with the medical examiner's office to request a fresh evaluation of the case. Could there have been a mistake in the original analysis somewhere? Captain Allen and his group were keen to find out the response. A noteworthy event occurred in April of 2021. After a thorough autopsy, the medical examiner determined that Selena had suffered from shaken baby syndrome, which was a devastating discovery. This disorder usually arises when a parent or other adult who is caring for a child shakes them violently out of exasperation or anger, which is often triggered by the child's incessant weeping. This severe shaking causes the child's brain to move back and forth inside the skull, which causes bruising, swelling, and often fatal brain hemorrhage. This case was re-evaluated with consideration for variables beyond the medical. The detective squad under Captain Allen's command knew they needed more. They conducted new interviews and combed through old records. All of a sudden, they were pounding on doors and talking to anyone who could possibly have the last few pieces to this awful puzzle. Marcelino's mother allegedly told detectives after Marcelino died that she had blacked out and didn't know how her daughter had died. However, as additional witnesses came forward, the detectives started to hear an alternative story. As the evidence grew, for the first time in nearly 2 decades, the pieces were fitting together to create a disturbing picture. Captain Allen, who was in possession of the recently acquired evidence and testimony, addressed the media and stated, "We were able to submit an arrest warrant for felony murder on the mother based on the evidence we had in new interviews." When police arrived to take Mary Jean into jail on September 23, 2022, nearly 20 years after the untimely death of her daughter Marcelino, one can only imagine how shocked she was. Following the death of her daughter, Mary moved to California. There, she was taken into custody by Yuba County Sheriff's Department deputies. Without being granted bond, she was held at the Yuba County Jail. Later, the authorities brought her back to Okaloosa County, Florida, where she was to face at least one murder accusation. Eric Aiden, the sheriff for Okaloosa County, stated that his detectives are driven to find a solution to these unresolved crimes. It's more than simply a job to them. They are passionate about their duty in delivering justice, which is why they are dedicated to looking for any piece of information that can shed light on a case that has stagnated. Thanks to the detectives' painstaking efforts, this case has given fresh life to a nearly 2-decade-old tragedy, maybe bringing justice and closure to young Marceline Eliza. Mary Jean Lisa was born in 1985, right in the middle of a terrible storm. She was a woman of Asian or Pacific Island descent, 38 years old. After her daughter passed away, Mary lived for a few years in 2324 Britannia Circle in Navarre, Florida. Mary gave the impression of having a typical existence, yet she was well known for having a fiery temper. This trait, which tainted many of her contacts, was characteristic of her relationships. Her outburst was more than just irritation. It was an explosive personality feature that was dominant. Regretfully, nobody in her life appeared to be able to manage this side of her. Despite Mary's lack of criminal background, she has now tragically run afoul of the law due to her rage. She has never before been found guilty of a crime. Thus, she finds herself at a difficult crossroads that nobody could have foreseen. The terrible occurrence that led to her incarceration is still being processed by friends, neighbors, and other community members. Police were called immediately to find out what went so terribly wrong. The specifics of this story shed light on the unfortunate circumstances surrounding the death of Marceline Eliza, a small toddler. The arrest report's details shed light on a dysfunctional family dynamic that ultimately came to an awful end. Marcelina's mother, Mary Jean Lisa, already had a case registered with the Florida Department of Children and Families and did not have primary custody of her at the time. The principal protectors of Marcelino, whose identities remain undisclosed, were organizing a trip outside of town. Because they value family, the Department of Children and Families granted Mary Jane permission to stay with Marcelino for an extended amount of time. The December 20th, 2002 was the date the agreement came into force. The visit appeared to be going well for the first few days. A caseworker visited the home 3 days after the overnight stay began. During the visits, Marcelino was observed by the caseworker to be healthy, active, and free from signs of injury or discomfort. When Mary Jean's sister came to visit the residence a few days later, on December 29th, she too saw that the child was safe and well. Then came December 30th, 2002. This would prove to be both an important and terrible day. This particular day, Mary Jean was at home by herself with her daughter. Later, an unidentified witness picked them up and saw something fishy straight away. Marcelino was sleepy and unresponsive. Out of worry, the witness asked Marcelino about his health for Mary Jean. In response, Mary Jean said that Marcelino had been sick for a few days. Despite the illness, Mary Jean had not taken her daughter to the doctor. As the day wore on, things continued to deteriorate. After Mary Jean changed Marcelino's diaper, a horrifying sequence of events took place. Marcelino's respiration ceased as she began to convulse. In an attempt to get the young girl medical attention, the witness and Mary Jean hurried her to Twin Cities Hospital in Niceville. Upon examination, it was discovered that she had 18 contusions in all. Subsequent CT scans showed evidence of brain atrophy and persistent blood clots on the brain surface. As a result, Sacred Heart Hospital in Pensacola received her. Sadly, though, she did not make it. Mary was kept in the desolate Hubert County Jail without being allowed to post bond while she awaited her court appearance. Her official name, Mary Jean Lisa, was stated there. A date was handed to her to record on her calendar, February 13th, 2023. It became increasingly clear how bad her situation was, and the date was meant to be a pre-trial meeting rather than a trial. This was an important phase in the legal process. During this vital pre-trial session, the judge would meet with the prosecution and defense. Typically, They discussed the evidence, considered potential plea agreements, and established the parameters for the trial's course. Mary's life would change significantly after this conference, potentially affecting how she would develop in the future. Since they haven't been made public yet, the contents of what transpired during Mary's pre-trial meeting are now being maintained under strict confidentiality. Without second thought, Sheriff Eric Aiden took a few minutes to address the neighborhood over Marceline Eliza's unsolved murder. He expressed his gratitude to the Okaloosa County Sheriff's Office investigators for their steadfast dedication. In particular, he conveyed his gratitude for the Criminal Investigative Division's unwavering commitment to the matter. Sheriff Aiden stressed how eager he and his colleagues are to re-examine past situations. They adopt a strong position. They are dedicated to looking, learning, and probing, even if there isn't an immediate solution. Their mission is to collect any information, no matter how small, that could lead them to a breakthrough in the cold case investigations. The Marceline Eliza case is the clearest example of this spirit of tenacity. It demonstrated the extent the group would go to ensure that justice was carried out. As information became available and the community looked for a solution, families, friends, and neighbors felt obliged to get in touch, reiterating their belief in the police and their search for the truth. What are your thoughts on this case? Do you believe Mary Angeliza killed her kid via purposeful shaking? Please share your thoughts in the comment section. Moving on to the next case. Sherry Rasmussen, February 24th, 1986. The 29-year-old Sherry Rasmussen is found dead on the ground, horribly injured, and covered in scars by the Los Angeles Police Department. The scene inside the house was disorganized. A broken china vase testified to the violence committed upon Sherry, while audio equipment was torn from the walls and furniture was thrown around. Everything suggests the same hypothesis to detectives: a robbery gone deadly. However, the autopsy reports, which presented a different picture, revealed a truth that lay under the surface. They noticed a bite mark on Sherry's left arm, which looked weird. What precisely transpired with Sherry? Was her terrible demise really the result of a robbery or act of retaliation? Sherry met a man named John Rutin in May 1984. They immediately hit it off and started dating. When they made the decision to get married a year later, John moved into Sherry's flat. February 24th, 1986. John moved out of their Balboa Boulevard condo to start his new work. Sherry had an inspirational speech to deliver at work that day, though. Approximately 9:45 a.m., a nearby resident saw something strange. The automobile wasn't there, but John's garage door was open. This was strange because John had always made sure all the doors were closed before leaving. John called home after around 15 minutes, but nobody answered. He dismissed it, supposing Sherry might have gone to work. However, his calls stayed unanswered throughout the day. John began to have doubts. But John's anxiety gauge went up when he checked in with Sherry's secretary and found out she hadn't arrived at work. Teresa Lane, Sherry's sister, also contacted her at around 10 in the morning. A maid cleaning an adjacent flat heard what sounded like a heated dispute, followed by a loud thump around 12:30 p.m., which put a twist in the story. John knew something wasn't right when he got home from work at 6 o'clock. Normally closed, the garage door was lopsided, and there was no sign of Sherry's BMW, which he had bought her as a proposal gift. It was strange that Sherry would have departed without notifying him, given her former arrangements. John saw broken glass fragments lying around as he approached the garage and knew right away where they had come from. There was a little balcony with a broken glass door over the garage. Through the garage, John entered the house. Sherry was lying there, terribly damaged, her body spread on the floor. She had scrapes and bruises all over her body, including on her head and neck, and her eyes were puffy. She had been lying there for some time, and her body was cold and stiff when John discovered her. Sadly, John tried to resuscitate her and frantically felt for a pulse, but there was none. He called 911 in a panic, and the police and paramedics arrived on the scene shortly after. There was complete mayhem in every room as the cops searched the crime scene. It was evident that there had been a fierce conflict since furniture was thrown around. A cracked porcelain vase gave away how serious Sherry's attack was. They found a bloody handprint close to the alarm system the couple had just installed, which added to the unsettling image. From the look of things, Sherry had tried desperately to set off the alarm to alert someone to her need for assistance. Unfortunately, though, she was unable to get there in time. It was obvious that there had been a fierce conflict inside the house, particularly in the living room. Tall stereo speakers were discovered by the investigators. One had been torn from the wall and dumped on the ground close to Sherry's corpse. They gathered more evidence from Sherry's body and the area as they carried out their investigation. In addition to using an assault kit to collect swabs from the bite marks they discovered on Sherry's arms, they searched the residence for fingerprints. Abrasions on Sherry's wrists, which pointed to the possibility that she had been restrained by a rope or cord, were also discovered by the investigators close to the front door. She had obviously battled so fiercely that the struggle snapped off her fingernails. The discovery that she had been shot 3 times in the chest added to the horror. They came to the startling conclusion that in spite of all her numerous injuries, it was the gunshots that eventually claimed her life. 2 bullets were discovered within Sherry, while one had exited her body through an incision on her back. It was evident that the .38 caliber handgun used to shoot them was discharged at a very close range. Investigators discovered a vibrantly quilted blanket on a living room chair, which furthered the mystery. It appeared to have been used to conceal the sound of the gunshots because it had 2 holes and powder burns. With all of this evidence, the police were able to quickly determine that this was not your typical crime. It was a badly executed heist gone horribly wrong. The police reported that Sherry was not expecting any crooks to break into her flat, but it appeared that at least 2 of them did. They so engaged in a bloody combat, which Sherry valiantly carried out to the very end. A number of hints suggested that this was a botched heist. Sherry's automobile was first stolen from the garage, which suggested that the thief intended to take. Second, a player and stereo equipment were discovered close to the stairs, indicating that the robbers intended to take them before the altercation. But during the altercation, things took a fatal turn, resulting in Sherry's terrible death. But there were problems with this heist theory. First, no evidence of forced entry was discovered by the police. This implied that Sherry had either given them the key to her flat or allowed the crooks entry. Second, the fact that every precious item, including a jewelry box, was unharmed cast doubt on the purpose of the break-in. Detectives interviewed every neighbor who lived near Sherry, but they were unable to find anything. Although a few neighbors claimed to have heard gunshots or witnessed someone entering Sherry's flat, others only heard the sounds of a struggle. In an effort to uncover information that would help solve the case, experts also took fingerprints and blood samples from the residence. But in the 1980s, DNA analysis was not yet feasible. The lead investigator thought of a way to get more evidence. Taking a piece of cotton, he dabbed at the bite mark that was discovered on Sherry's torso. If the assailant had left behind saliva, perhaps it would provide a crucial hint that would lead to the murderer's capture. Following a thorough check of the residence, investigators discovered a fascinating fact. The marriage license between Sherry and John was the only item that the robbers had stolen. Given that John was the one closest to Sherry and may have had easy access to the flat, this aroused questions and suspicions. Nevertheless, John's strong alibi and lack of a clear motive meant that he was soon discarded as a suspect in the death of his wife. To further cleanse his name, it was he who reported the missing certificate to the police. Detectives at the scene were baffled as to why the robbers had only taken Sherry and John's marriage license. Remaining steadfast in their notion of robbery, they concentrated on identifying the culprits. They found it after a week and a half of looking. 4 kilometers from Sherry's apartment, in a parking area, was where her automobile was recovered. In some cases, 2 robbers would enter apartments via the garage while pointing weapons and taking audio equipment. The main detective thought Sherry's murder might have been committed by the same people. They graded crude sketches of the suspects and attempted to locate them through witness statements. They discovered that the two men were Latinos as well. The suspects were never located, nevertheless, in spite of their best attempts. Sherry's parents were dissatisfied with the lack of advancement and believed that insufficient efforts were being made by investigators to determine the cause of their daughter's untimely demise. Sherry's father, Nels Rasmussen, wasn't persuaded by the police's burglary scenario. He was a frequent visitor to the police station, encouraging the investigators to look into alternative options. It was difficult for him to accept that Sherry, who was tall, robust, and in excellent physical condition, could have been overcome in a poorly executed break-in. Nels pushed for a more extensive investigation into the matter because he was adamant about finding out the truth about what had actually happened to his daughter. Though Nels was unaware of the identity of John's ex-girlfriend because Sherry had never brought it up, he asked the police to investigate. Sherry did, however, confide in her father about the disturbing vibe she was getting from the unannounced visits from the ex-girlfriend. However, who was this enigmatic woman, and what was her relationship to John? Stephanie Lazarus, by the way, wasn't just any old ex-girlfriend. Rather, she was an LAPD cop. Stephanie fell hard for John right away, but he didn't realize she was interested in him romantically. He had no idea that she had feelings for him beyond that of a good friend. John believed everyone could see that their relationship was little more than friendship sporadically tinged with sexual closeness. He never felt the need to ask Stephanie about her thoughts or to communicate his own because of this. However, Stephanie knew all too well that John had no love feelings for her. Therefore, Stephanie was devastated to learn on June 4th, 1985, that John and Sherry were engaged. When Stephanie called John that evening, her voice was shaking as she begged, "I must see you immediately. Please make yourself known." John agreed out of concern and rushed over to Stephanie's place. She was still crying when he got there, which really alarmed him. He had known Stephanie for 7 years, but he had never seen her this unhappy. He attempted to comfort her, but before he could speak, Stephanie broke down in tears and declared her love for him. "I told you I loved you. I have always adored you. I was just unable to watch you get married to someone else." Although John was surprised by Stephanie's admission, he was sure that their relationship had always been unambiguous. He softly told her that he was genuinely in love with Sherry and that they didn't feel the same way. Stephanie persevered and begged John one last time to sleep with her, but he refused. John grudgingly agreed, feeling bad for Stephanie, but he made it plain that this would be their last time together and that they would not be able to see each other again. Sherry was unaware of John and Stephanie's complex connection at this moment. She had no idea that Stephanie had more unexpected plans in her sleeve that would soon throw their lives for a loop. Stephanie paid Sherry a surprise visit at the Glendale Adventist Medical Center in August of 1985. Stephanie went to have a private discussion with Sherry in her office. After shutting the door, they talked for a short while. After Stephanie finally departed, Sherry came out of her office with tears in her eyes and a clearly troubled appearance. Everyone could see that Sherry was really upset about something. Sherry contacted her father Nels that evening and told him about the uncomfortable experience she had with Stephanie. She revealed the unsettling letter she got, but she refrained from revealing Stephanie's identity. John was unable to be with anybody else if he couldn't be with Stephanie. However, Stephanie's invasive actions didn't stop there. She went to Sherry's place on her second visit and requested John to wax her skis. John followed Stephanie's instructions in spite of Sherry's protests. Sherry thought her behavior was strange, especially because she was sporting attractive exercise gear. Sherry addressed John after Stephanie departed, asking him whether their romance was really gone. John told her that Stephanie and he were simply friends. But a few days later, Stephanie came back to get her skis, this time armed and wearing her police uniform. Sherry begged John to stop Stephanie's frequent visits as she became more and more agitated. But John brushed off her worries, telling her that their relationship was over and told her to ignore Stephanie's behavior. However, Sherry was unable to get rid of her persistent doubts regarding Stephanie's enigmatic appearances and her ability to get past the security systems at their apartment building. Sherry once noticed a hooded stranger watching at them in a restaurant when she was eating with John. As soon as she turned to look back, the enigmatic figure vanished. He was hiding his face, so Sherry couldn't tell who he was. Sherry's father was so anxious for answers that he told the investigators about these unpleasant experiences, hoping they would listen to him. But their lack of concern only made the family's anger and worry worse. Investigators were positive that the two males who had broken into an apartment close to Sherry's house were responsible for the murder. But 3 months after the terrible catastrophe, an odd development happened. A number of important case files related to Sherry's disappeared from the police station inexplicably. These contained the detectives' thorough documents that tracked the development of the ongoing inquiry, but they were mysteriously missing. Serious doubts were raised by its absence. Was this a true accident, or had these materials been deleted from the case files on purpose? Given that an LAPD officer was involved in the case, the victim's relatives suspected foul play. But no meaningful leads materialized, and the matter went unresolved for years. When lead investigator Mayer departed 7 years later, Sherry's father took the chance to speak with his replacement in the hopes of a more dedicated handling of the case. Sherry's father even offered to pay for the investigator to perform a DNA study at her request. But the detective brushed it off, saying there was no point comparing the DNA profile to the absence of a suspect. The detective, who was still of the opinion that Sherry's case involved only a poorly executed heist, asked him to go on. John, meanwhile, formed a new family and moved on with his life. But then strange things started to happen. He got in touch with Stephanie again, and they decided to go to Hawaii together. Nevertheless, something unexpected happened right before their journey. John called the police directly to find out whether there was any fresh information connecting Stephanie to Sherry's death. It came out that John was adamant about getting justice for Sherry and suspected Stephanie of being involved in her murder. But despite continuing his close friendship with Stephanie, he kept this suspicion to himself for years and was reluctant to discuss it. 3 years later, she moved to Simi Valley with her partner, a fellow officer, and they adopted a daughter. Stephanie kept up their relationship, meeting John on a regular basis despite her flawless reputation. It appeared as though Sherry's murder would go unsolved forever as time went on. But in 2001, there was a ray of optimism when a dedicated Los Angeles cold case team was formed to address unsolved homicides. This unit's detectives were given Sherry's case, along with thousands more. The cotton piece that might have held the attacker's saliva after they bit someone during the assault was one piece of evidence. Detectives took up Sherry's case again 2 years later, in 2003, and sent all of the evidence they had for DNA testing to a lab. But Jennifer Francis, a lab technician, didn't start working on it until December 2003. They had to wait almost 2 years for the results because of a backlog of cases. When Jennifer finally examined the blood samples from the apartment and the fingernail clippings in January 2005, she found that Sherry was the only person whose DNA was present. All that was left to do was examine the leftover sample taken from Sherry's bite mark. Still, there remained an issue. For a whole day, no one could find the vial containing the sample. It was found next to a large refrigerator's wall after a thorough search. It seemed as though an attempt had been made to eliminate any evidence connected to the murderer. Fortunately, this important detail had been missed. Francis examined the sample and found that the DNA belonged to an unknown woman. She hurriedly compared it to the FBI database, but was shocked to find that there were no matches. After learning that the DNA matched to a woman, she looked into it further and discovered information regarding a third-party female who was allegedly harassing the deceased prior to her death, both at home and at work. Curious about the probable connection, Francis questioned the supervising detective if they had looked into this woman before. She was taken aback by his answer. "Oh, you mean the LAPD detective?" He continued by saying that the woman in question was the victim's husband's previous girlfriend who was working as an LAPD detective at the time. But he cut off any connection right once, saying emphatically, "She's not involved in this." They did not consider any other options. And the case became cold again as they ran into a dead end in their hunt for fresh leads. Sherry's case presented a number of difficulties, with progress frequently coming to a standstill. But in February 2009, a new chance presented itself when Jim Nuttall and Pete Barbera took up the Van Wees probe. They went over the materials that earlier researchers had left carefully. They discarded the burglary scenario after discovering that the DNA evidence pointed to a female suspect, and they understood they would have to start over from scratch. Rather than seeing it as a straightforward burglary, Nuttall and Barba suspected murder. They thought the burglary was staged to hide the true intention. The crime scene didn't match the description of a regular break-in, especially because it occurred during the day. Sherry's jewelry box sat unopened on her dresser, a clear target for thieves. They therefore made the decision to compile a list of all the ladies who might be connected to Sherry's slaying. Following some research, they had 5 names: Stephanie, 3 other young women, and one of Sherry's co-workers. When John revealed over the phone that Stephanie was a police officer, Nuttall was taken aback. Stephanie was a detective in the Commercial Crimes Division at the time, having been promoted to a higher position. She was handling cases involving art theft. They quickly eliminated the 3 ladies from the list with the help of other investigators, since they had strong alibis and no ulterior intentions. They then focused on the nurse who was employed by Sherry. Given the information in the case file about their strained relationship, the police took a covert sample of her DNA from the garbage she had thrown out. When the profile taken from the sample was evaluated by experts, they discovered that it didn't match the saliva that was discovered at the bite site. As a result, Stephanie Lazarus was the only suspect the detectives had left. But in the course of this investigation, the detectives and their colleagues agreed to withhold this knowledge until they could obtain hard proof against Stephanie or exclude her involvement. They wanted to avoid her building a solid defense if she was, in fact, the murderer, so they kept it quiet. The fact that Stephanie worked in the same building and on the same floor as them was curiously fortuitous. They took many steps to keep everything secret, including not writing her name in the notes. Rather, Stephanie was addressed as just number 5. As they dug further into Stephanie's life in the middle of the 1980s, they made their first fascinating discovery. Stephanie had a Smith & Wesson kind .40938 caliber revolver at the time of the murder, the same kind that Sherry was shot with. Investigators also found that Sherry had complained about Stephanie's strange and occasionally hostile behavior on multiple occasions. When they discovered that Stephanie had repeatedly broken into Sherry's apartment and the gated neighborhood, the narrative intensified. In a devastating discovery, the investigators learned that Stephanie had submitted an odd report at the police station 2 weeks before to the murder. She said that a .38 caliber revolver was taken from her car, which was parked close to the dock, during a break-in. Investigators were taken aback by this discovery, particularly in light of the circumstances surrounding Sherry's murder. That Stephanie would opportunistically claim the theft of a weapon that was identical to the one used in the incident seemed extremely suspicious. The detectives didn't take long to alert their superiors once Stephanie turned out to be the main suspect. They came up with a scheme to stealthily gather a DNA sample for her, choosing to discard it voluntarily so as not to reveal the nature of the research to her. Undercover agents watched Stephanie's every move for a full week, waiting for the right opportunity. Finally, on May 28, 2009, their opportunity presented itself. For a quick snack, Stephanie stopped by a cafe with her stepdaughter. The moment they stepped outside, the police moved quickly to seize the glass that Stephanie had taken a sip from. They immediately sent it to the lab for analysis in the hopes that it might finally provide a breakthrough in the case. The results were given by the lab the next day, and they were shocking. The DNA from Sherry's body discovered near the bite mark exactly matched the DNA from Stephanie's glass. It validated the police's long-held suspicion that Stephanie was Sherry's murderer. The shocking prospect that Stephanie was responsible for the removal of important documents from the initial investigation and for erasing any evidence of her involvement was revealed by this discovery. But there was no denying the indisputable DNA evidence. Not having much time to think things through, the investigators quickly turned their attention to creating a strategy for Stephanie's arrest. Even though it appeared risky to face Stephanie when she was with her husband and stepdaughter, the investigators considered the possibility of arresting Stephanie at home. Rather than that, they discussed ways to force someone of Stephanie's status to give up their weapon. They eventually came up with an excellent fix. Holding cells for the short-term custody of criminals were located in the police department basement. Entry required the surrender of a weapon. This brilliant scheme offered the ideal means of apprehending Stephanie without raising any issues with her family's involvement. It's time to entice Stephanie to the cells in the basement. The detectives came up with a cunning scheme. Two investigators approached her on June 5, 2009, carrying covert microphones. They informed her that they had detained a person who may have information about paintings that had been stolen. They looked to Stephanie for her knowledge because she had dealt with art thefts before. Stephanie went along to the basement where the culprit was allegedly being detained after voluntarily offering to help the investigators. The first element of the plan came together as she gave up her firearm. Stephanie was surprised to find herself in the interrogation room, though. Rather than come up with a suspect, the detectives slowly and methodically started to disclose their cards one by one. To elicit more information from Stephanie about her prior experiences, the investigators started by gently probing her memory. When Stephanie revealed her relationship with John, the topic inevitably turned to Sherry. Inquiring into the oddities of their interactions, including the unannounced visits and circumstances that might have connected Stephanie to the murder, they asked her to recollect her memories of Sherry. When asked about Sherry during the interview, Stephanie seemed more uncomfortable and defensive and made an effort to disavow any memory of their previous exchanges. Stephanie tried to duck and dodge, but she unintentionally gave away enough about their past. It was now her turn to hear the truth from the detectives. Stephanie was given permission to leave following the interrogation. However, as she got to the end of the hallway, a number of police officers were waiting for her, handcuffed. Stephanie's eventual arrest marked a dramatic occasion 23 years after the crime. She firmly denied any involvement and insisted on her innocence even during the official interrogation, exercising her right to silence. The detectives were forced to get the paperwork ready for her transport to court because she was not going to confess. After being incarcerated for a few years, Stephanie appeared in court for the first time in 2012. The defense cast doubt on the results of the DNA test and emphasized that Stephanie had not been the subject of any earlier accusations during the trial. Nevertheless, the court was not persuaded by these reasons. The prosecution laid forth their argument, claiming that Stephanie had entered Sherry's apartment on the day of the murder after waiting for John to depart for work. She confronted Sherry once inside, which caused the fight to spill downstairs. Finally, Stephanie broke a vase over Sherry's head to render her unconscious before shooting and killing her. She then set up a fictitious burglary scene in order to hide her tracks, and she departed the scene after obtaining their marriage license. They found a journal in her home from the middle of the 1980s, which was full of notes about her love for John and her frustration with his relationship with Sherry. But there was no talk about her gun being taken. Her computer history also showed that she had searched for John's name several times in the late 1990s. These results strengthened the prosecution's case by illuminating Stephanie's fixation on John and her possible motivations for the crime. Stephanie's fate was sealed on March 8, 2012, when the jury found her guilty of murder. The judge's sentencing of 27 years to life in prison, plus an extra 2 years for wielding a service weapon, caused the courtroom to fall silent. John had moved on with his life, and Stephanie was at last behind bars. The idea that she killed Sherry and destroyed 3 lives in the process is heartbreaking. But for what purpose? Stephanie ultimately failed in her attempts to win John's love, and she is now also miserable. Sherry's story might have remained hidden in old archives if it weren't for the committed investigators who took up the case. But justice was eventually done because of their knowledge and the strength of DNA evidence. With the knowledge that the person who had stolen their daughter was in prison, Sherry's parents were at last able to find comfort. Moving on to the next case. Tony Garcia. Two newspaper delivery boys in Camarillo, California, which is roughly 50 miles from Los Angeles, made a terrifying discovery on January 18, 1981, at around 6:30 a.m. They discovered the lifeless body of Oxnard College student Rachel Zendejas, a 20-year-old single mother of two. Rachel lived in an apartment building on Mobile Avenue, directly across the street from where her terrible destiny was waiting for her. She had recently gone through a divorce. Rachel, who lived in an apartment with her brother and two daughters, was tragically killed in the complex's garage. As soon as they got to the scene of the crime, law officers collected important evidence that would help with their investigation. When investigators dug deeper into the case, they discovered that Rachel had gone out the night before her murder to find babysitters to watch her small girls. After leaving off the babysitters and heading back home the next morning, Rachel was attacked by her attacker as she got out of her car. Heartbreaking and puzzling were the circumstances surrounding her murder. In their years-long pursuit of justice, the police never stopped pursuing leads and looked into every possibility. But in the end, all leads were worn out, and the investigation went cold despite their unwavering efforts. The unsolved murder of Rachel Zendejas left her family and the community in a condition of hopelessness. However, a neighbor's call to the police in the early hours of December 12, 1981, would rekindle optimism just before the year ended. The inquiry was revived after the Naval reported a fire outbreak at an Oxnard residence. The Oxnard Fire Department quickly went to the scene after getting the emergency call and put out the roaring fire. Later on in their inquiry, they came upon a disturbing find. Lisa Gondek, a 21-year-old lady, was discovered dead and naked in the bathtub of her apartment. She had clearly been the victim of a horrific crime because her attacker had not only sexually assaulted and strangled her, but also set the apartment on fire. Surprisingly, her neighbors heard her shouts loudly, but they didn't notify the authorities until the smoke started to smell strongly. Lisa Gondek, an Oxnard resident and retail employee, had spent the evening of December 11, 1981, at a club at the Port Hueneme Naval Installation. Around 1:30 a.m., after spending time at the disco with her pals, she was left off at her house. The following day, she was tragically found dead in her bathtub, and for many years afterward, no one knew who killed her. Originally, Louis Gondek left Connecticut for Oxnard in order to spend 2 weeks visiting a buddy who was serving in the U.S. Navy. Even so, months before her tragic death, she finally decided to go to Oxnard. She had half promised her loved ones that she would spend Christmas with them before she passed away, saying, "Mom, I'll be home for Christmas." Lisa Gondek went to Oxnard and took up residence with her best friend from childhood. She was hired by the Aspeneye Retail Mall to work at a teen apparel store. She made new acquaintances fast, even though she was new to the neighborhood. Lisa's roommate said that in addition to being kind-hearted, she was also attractive on the inside and exterior. Her roommate said Lisa would gladly share $1 with you if she had one. At first, separate investigations were carried out into the instances of Lisa Gondek and Rachel Zendejas. On the other hand, the FBI's combined DNA index system received the suspect's DNA in 2002 when it was discovered at Rachel Zendejas' crime scene. We searched the criminal database for convicts, but regrettably we were unable to find any. However, in 2004, after using DNA testing, the investigators working on Lisa Gondek's case notified the Ventura County Sheriff's Office that a single suspect was connected to the murders of both Rachel Zendejas and Lisa Gondek. Sadly, the DNA test yielded no identifying information about the culprit, and the investigation was once again abandoned. The fact that both women had been to a nightclub named Huntington in the hours before their deaths made for an additional fascinating connection. Across from the Esplanade Mall, this once popular nightclub is now shuttered. The Ventura County Cold Case Unit resumed control of the investigations in December 2019. To find prospective relatives of the suspects, they used genetic genealogy and advanced DNA testing. This strategy produced fresh leads, and subsequently, DNA testing verified Tony Garcia's identity as the main suspect in both killings. Ironically, Tony Garcia had been residing in Oxnard for more than 40 years, right beneath the detective's nose. He was stationed at Point Magu, close to Oxnard, and had served in the U.S. Navy. He was born in Roswell, New Mexico. Despite being released from the military in 1980, Tony Garcia made the decision to stay in Oxnard, where he followed his love of Carowit and spent many years as a committed learner and teacher. Tony Garcia worked as a carpenter at the time of his arrest. It is still unclear if he was acquainted in any way with his victims before. In addition to the 2 murder accusations against him, Tony Garcia was also accused of killing someone while participating in a rape and killing someone while abducting someone. When he appeared in court for the first time, the order was to hold him without bond. After Tony Gash was apprehended, Rachel Zinnergass's brother Roy Rodriguez stated, "I'm going to finish Rachel's case and accomplish my goal." Thanks for watching. We hope you enjoyed exploring these intriguing cold cases with us. If you found the video fascinating, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to Cold Case Mystique for more deep dives into unsolved mysteries. Your support helps us bring you more compelling content. Leave a comment below with your thoughts or any cases you'd like us to cover next. See you in the next video, and remember, the search for truth never stops.